This is not intended as a direct response to Maurice. I think our interests are very different from each other. It's also not, and I want to be clear about this up front, it's not to say that hierarchy or, meta systems or meta cybernetics can't be useful in some cases. For me, it's important that when we do use hierarchical reasoning, that we be clear about it to ourselves, and we'll also be clear about the consequences. And for me, the consequences that I want to avoid are in the social domain. When you bring this kind of thinking into the social domain, it has consequences that, in my opinion, can be quite negative. Maurice's presentation did remind me of a presentation I heard many, many years ago by Bill Powers. Perceptual control theory is what it's called now. And I remember him describing, he was a little reluctant to do this, but in a fairly private setting, because he wasn't licensed as a psychoanalyst, but he did it. People would go to him and he would take them through these stages of a hierarchy. And he would even describe occasionally someone would shoot up through this hierarchy and out the top end and have an enlightenment and a mystical experience of some kind. And it was very logical, but it did not. For me, what it didn't do was it didn't circle back to either to the individual or to the psychoanalyst in this case. I put a quote here from Barry Commoner. It could have been many other people. I just happened to come across it with Commoner's name. Everything is connected to everything else. And I put it here because it seems that those of us in systems and cybernetics agree with this. Take it as an assumption, almost. And that everything is connected to everything else is not to say that we can identify causal connections between everything and everything else. Rather, it's to say that at least in a nonlinear dynamic world, that any perturbation anywhere can have some disturbance someplace else, anyplace else, in that world. And so that's the complexity that we're dealing with. While I would like to talk about how we collectively use the word cybernetics, I find I need to keep it personalized. This is how I view cybernetics. I think there are others that with which I'm aligned. But for me, one of the promises of cybernetics originally was to be an alternative to linear in hierarchical thinking, which was predominant. Still, I say it is predominant in the world that we live in. And so that promise is still there, and I take it seriously. For me, cybernetics takes circularity seriously. And circularity, not just feedback loops, not just mutual causality, but also re-entry. In case of cybernetics, re-entry of cybernetics into its own set of concepts. Re-entry does create a paradox, a recursion of the dynamics of operations. It's this that we have to embrace. It's this we have to be recognized and recognize from a logical point of view what it does and what the consequences are. And the three cases that I want to talk about are the case of whole systems, of second order cybernetics or higher order, in the case of the meta paradigm. And these are things that have been talked about, in our discussions for many weeks by various contexts. Okay, whole systems. Often talked about as every system is contained within some other system, which is contained within some other system. And if we want to get at it, we need to create this whole system, as big a system as we can, to account for all of the connections. I think it's important to recognize that a system that contains everything distinguishes nothing. And as we observers that actually distinguish a system, we distinguish it as something that might be useful for us when we do so. and we by doing so, by us as observers distinguishing it, we're including ourselves and our criteria in what we distinguish. In other words, we close the system at some point. That closure creates a self-referential recursion. The system includes itself as a member. And it is the inclusion of the observer that makes the system whole, not how big the system is or how much it includes. So there's no hierarchy. Recursion, yes, but it's not a meta system. There is no meta system, but there is reentry. The system reenters itself. Case of second order cybernetics, for me, is particularly problematic. Einstein Forster invented the word, as far as I know, and he invented it to talk about the cybernetics of cybernetics, which was the challenge that Margaret Mead laid before a conference and wrote a short paper on. But the cybernetics of cybernetics, it collapses to cybernetics, and that's what we have now, is a cybernetics. He did not intend it, to imply that it's a meta cybernetics. It's not a meta cybernetics. I think the use of it was unfortunate that it sort of, because it sort of begs for higher orders. And someone says, "Oh, why not third? Why not fourth?" and so forth. And that was not, in my reading, the intent. At that time that he used this term, there were other kinds of uses of second order, like the change of change, which was called second order change. There's still change. So there's, and Heinz was quite clear about this when you were talking about the possibility of higher order. He said, not needed. You have cybernetics of cybernetics. You don't need cybernetics of cybernetics of cybernetics. Cybernetics re-enters its own domain of concept. It's a self-referential process. There is no hierarchy.
I find it difficult to follow now. Perhaps you can clear that up or so.
Well, let me finish. The last example might help a little bit. I don't know.
Okay.
But what I'm saying, without going into the details of the logic, that does not. We can think. It's possible to think. What I'm saying, without hierarchy, without sort of being outside the system. That's the idea of meta being above the system, looking at the system being outside it. Rather, we're in it. So there is no recursion in process. Then the final case, here's the case of the meta paradigm. I've talked often about cybernetics as a way of thinking about ways of thinking, of which it is one. It re-enters its own domain. So it's not a meta way of thinking. And what I'm suggesting, I think, is that when we, to talk about a meta paradigm is to create an idea from a position of some superiority and therefore generate a hierarchy. I wanted to add this note that when I talk about ways of thinking, talking about that which is embedded in our languages and the logics that they carry, and therefore we think together in those languages with which we interact, even as we may experience it individually. That's not too close. And then this is the diagram. So if I talk about cybernetics as a way of thinking about ways of thinking, I had the set of all ways of thinking, of which cybernetics is one. But it is about these set of ways of thinking. So cybernetics is both here, up here, this is the description of it, and here, inside and outside simultaneously. No hierarchy. So that's what I wanted to make. And this has to do with how we talk and therefore how we think, about cybernetics, but also about the social domain and what the possibilities might be. And I'd like to think that there are possibilities for non-hierarchical thinking, particularly in the social domain where we've seen what the consequences can be, the negative consequences. Not to say it's not useful, as long as, on occasion, very useful. And we live in it, so we have to deal with it anyway. So that's it.
Questions?
Larry, could you clarify what you mean by re-entry?
Yeah, it's in this case, we have cybernetics here as a set, as a way of thinking among the sets of ways of thinking. But it's a way of thinking about ways of thinking. So it re-enters its own domain, which in this case are the set of ways of thinking.
My inclination would be not to use the word meta, but the word AP. So it is not. So if you use the word meta, you go to a hierarchy.
Right.
But if you use the word AP, it is just next in addition. So, for example, if we take a body, yeah, there are all kinds of functions there. And we may think that the brain is controlling it, but the brain is AP in relation to all the other functions, which are, yeah, you could model them as orthogonal.
Yeah, that would be an improvement.
Bernard here. I've just posted a summary of some of what Heinz says about this. Heinz says, and I can give you all the exact reference if you want, and I'm sure Larry can. The second order is the transcendence into the domain of self-reference and reflexivity. You know, it's a radically new move to go from first order of observed systems to the second order of observing systems, which include the human observers like ourselves, who can communicate and reflect on our own actions and so on. So, and he says, invoking higher orders can be done. He does it himself when he refers to the I as a relator of infinite order. I give the example there. I observe me, observing me, observing me, observing me. I'm invoking a kind of hierarchy, but it's all still within the domain of self-reference. Nothing new has been added. So it's a different sense of, you could say that's metacognition, or you can say it's an hierarchy of reflection. It doesn't matter. These are just the labels. The important point is that Heinz is stressing the reflexivity, the self-reference, and the responsibility of being an observer. Now, in contrast, I see Morris's constructs largely, you know, a standard use of concepts of hierarchy of system, first order, second order, third order, fourth. And that's perfectly standard usage throughout science, not just in cybernetics, to have orders of systems, orders of hierarchy. So I think what Larry is doing, or is trying to do, is to get us back to, well, at least make us more aware of what Heinz was up to when he coined the term second order cybernetics. I think Larry says himself, it's in some ways it's an unfortunate term because it invites the invocation of higher orders. I noticed that I don't think, correct me if I'm wrong, I don't think Hamid Maturana ever used the term second order cybernetics. He did take part he talked about the biology of cognition, and he also took part in a panel session on the new cybernetics, which included Gordon Pask. And Gordon Pask, as far as I know, never used the term second order cybernetics. He referred either to the new cybernetics or neoclassical cybernetics for his own work in conversation theory, which is intrinsically self-referential in the sense of Heinz's second order cybernetics. So I see them all essentially, Heinz, Gordon and Humberto, dealing with this issue of the observer being part of the observation and taking responsibility for the observation, including observations of herself and being part of a community. So I don't know if that's helpful or not, but
yeah, I've heard of the first, second, third, fourth orders being used to describe time periods. In other words, it's completely different from what Heinz had intended, you know, that word to be used. I think it was Catherine Hales that talks about 3 waves of cybernetics. So you have the first wave, second wave, third wave, and they sort of correspond to first order, second order, and so someone might say, okay, the third way must be third order, but that's not the intent that Heinz had for it. It was not intended to be something that distinguishes periods of time, a history. It was not intended that way.
Yeah, just an add-on to that, I think throughout all our discussions, it's always important to recognize that labels themselves are not meaning carriers. What is important are the distinctions that are being made by a particular contributor, a particular observer. And it's the distinctions we make which appear to be different in certain cases, although we tend to use the same labels for them. And we think there might be some similarity, and in fact, there aren't. So we need more of a kind of consistent or awareness about how each of us use these terms in a particular conversational context or systemic context. He said using some labels.
In that case, Bernard, they should be thrown away.
Beg your pardon?
In that case, the label should be thrown away.
Well, we
Because
can't.
it only confuses.
Well, when I say labels, I'm talking about languaging generally, where we, if in Heinz's terms, objects that we construct and distinguish are tokens for the real thing, as it were, then our labels, our symbols, our languaging are tokens for the tokens, and we wave them about. I mean, I often also preach that if we're going to use discourse language, we need to, at certain points, ground it pragmatically or operationally into the distinctions that we're making. So I was very particularly happy to see that when Morris was tackled about these abstractions that he was weaving around, he could ground it in his studies of the personalities of world leaders, which gives a relevance and an immediacy to what he's about. It grounds his work, and at that point it becomes something that we can all look at without necessarily sharing the terminology or even sharing the same systemic order of distinctions.
Larry, what does the circle, the biggest circle, mean here?
It's a set of all ways of thinking.
So it's the boundary of the set
Yes.
defined by you.
Yes.
And so cybernetics is one of the elements in the set, but why could it be jump out like your red arrow?
I'm proposing that cybernetics, unlike all other ways of thinking, is a way of thinking about ways of thinking.
Uniqueness.
Yes.
Well,
Not in a meta sense, not in a superiority sense.
If I could just comment,
it's one enough.
It reminds me one of our colleagues. I don't hear his name. He told me cybernetics is racist because it had got some kind of a supremacy going on. And this morning, I just saw the California Educational Department just defined that being good at math is racist.
may I just add to this point about ways of thinking?
I was shocked, but anyway, so that little arrow going up is a racist arrow.
Back to Larry and his ways of thinking. One of the classic simple definitions of what philosophy is about, and philosophy is a label for a huge mess of God knows what, praise the Lord, is, I can't remember the author of the book, but he's a well-known UK philosopher, called Thinking About Thinking. Obviously that's second order. What we get with cybernetics or second order cybernetics is a coherent way of talking about these ways of thinking about thinking, in my view.
Yeah.
We've got with Gordon, with Heinz, and with Umberto, there are biologically based models of cognition and human cognition, social cognition, and so on, which are quite clear. The models are clear. It's the consequences of applying those models to ourselves as well as to our worlds that are important. So thinking about thinking That's all grist to the mill of cybernetics. In fact, I go so far as to say that since second order cybernetics appeared, philosophy has only become of historical interest. It's a completely, out of date way of thinking about the world or labeling things in the world. And I do include critical realism there, which Morris quoted, which I do not have time to criticize in any depth. But it's you put the two side by side, second order cybernetics and critical realism, you realize that critical realism has got itself into a knot where it's got buried inside it certain assumptions, which in second order cybernetics, no observer would claim to be absolutes. Thank you.
What is important here is we've made a point of consolidation. Whether it be order or values or superiority, that doesn't matter. What matters is what Bernard talks about, is the distinctions we make, and that then leads to what is it that we are doing in cybernetics. So you're looking at blind spots. Freud called it the subconscious. He was into the physics world. That didn't work. But the ability to look at our blind spots, and what Larry talks about is the reentry of a G. Spencer Brown, because based on a distinction, you have me over here and thee over there. So the ability to come together in terms of perceptional research and learning research, which is both reentry strategies. And I'm sure there must be other ones, but I think if we look at that, we can really make some advancements, Larry, on how do you use cybernetics. To go back to Maurice's point, it's about getting work done.
Exactly.
The whole field that we're working in, and we don't go off the cliff.
We need to have a utilitarian dimension to actually make things happen and getting things done. But let's go to Jerry.
May I offer a point following up the cognitive blind spot that Lowell pointed out, and I heard Bernard Scott articulating it. He says philosophy is thinking about thinking, but that's actually not entirely true. Philosophy is also thinking about communicating. And so that's where the blind spot is. If you just think it's about thinking, then you get in some circular causality, actually, because then you don't see how the world changes while we are thinking and talking. So cybernetics is, I think, trying to point out the discursive processes and how we really need to pay attention. And I like to call them from now on feed-forward processes, because there apparently was someone who gave a presentation at the Macy Foundation suggesting that label better capture what is going on in cybernetics than just circular. Anyway, I want to point out communication, and I think that Larry is somehow touching on that.
So Morris gave us a model, and Larry gave us another model, and now they are having a competition about which model is becoming more useful. Let's hear Jerry's.
Can I make a quick observation, Jason? A very quick one that connects the two talks so far. I've lost the picture now, but if you go back to Spencer Brown, that when we sit outside the circle as cybernetics to make distinctions inside the circle of ways of thinking, once we do that, we make a crossing. We cross into the circle, and we can't take, we lose then the focus on cybernetics. So we have to take a model of cybernetics with us into the circle. That's the re-entry. And that model is what Morris is also talking about when he's trying to talk about intelligence, in my opinion.
Yeah.